Hello everybody, this is Kathy from Synapse Care Solutions. Welcome back to another weekly live stream and to our September 2023 series on language nutrition in the NICU. This week we have Sarah Bakke, who is now a pediatric nurse practitioner in the CVICU at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. But at the time of this presentation, she was the NICU developmental care specialist and lead NeuroNICU champion at Nemours Children's. So this presentation reviews some really amazing background data around why we need language nutrition programs in the NICU, the value, and then how we can take such a simple practice and have a huge impact not only on our babies and their brain development, but their families as well. Stay tuned for more live streams every Monday, 11 a.m. Pacific, all month, and we're going to focus on some different programs, not only for the NICU, but beyond. I hope that you'll enjoy this presentation with Sarah, and I'll see you at the end.
I'm very excited to be with you today. Back the very first ONE conference I attended in Ontario, California, and at the time, I think I can say this because I'm sure a lot of people feel this way too, I was a Mary Coughlin stalker. So I sought out opportunities to see her speak in person and really just felt so inspired by everything she had to say. And that's how I found out about Kathy's conference, because I wanted to go and see Mary speak. And then I just discovered Kathy. And she really has inspired me to, continue my journey in all things baby brain and trying to improve my personal practice and educating others around me. So I have nothing to disclose related to this presentation. So here are our objectives. We're going to go through some basic neurodevelopment and sensory integration information, and then talk about the role of sensory support programs in the NICU, specifically a language nutrition program, and talk about what the major components of a program are and how you can build one. So I think it's so interesting seeing how complex the newborn brain is and really seeing that in this picture. So 100 billion neurons and trillions of synaptic connections are present in the term brain. And how does it get there? So what are the major processes that happen, the critical phases in early brain development? So there's like structural things, and then there are wiring things happening that are important to understand. So I think the most obvious from this picture are those structural changes. So you can see from that rudimentary structure that we see in the first trimester progressing to that very smooth lissencephalic brain, and then progressing to that very complex term brain with all the gyral sulcal folding. And we know that plays a very important role in the brain because that allows for more surface area to be packed into a smaller area, and that translates to processing power for that baby. And then if we look down at the bottom there, we're talking more about the networking processes that are happening. So the neurulation that happens early, that's the neural plate folds and fuses to form the neural tube, and that's the neurulation, that top bullet there. So next we have proliferation. So all those neural stem cells are going to form lots and lots of neurons, 40 to 50% more neurons than the adult brain will utilize, which is incredible. Then migration occurs, so all of those neurons are going to travel to their destination in the brain and form connections, or synaptogenesis. And then pruning occurs, so that's this use or lose. The connections that we use frequently are going to strengthen, but those that we don't are going to get pruned back in that synaptic pruning process. And then those that are used frequently will go on to strengthen and myelinate. We know that brain growth during the third trimester and postnatally is the period of the most rapid brain growth that will occur in a child's lifetime. So the brain grows 80% in the first 18 months. Just an incredible amount of growth is happening right before our eyes when they're in the NICU. And what we need to remember is that what we're talking about when we're talking about that great growth is that all these neurons are being produced, and then the amount of connections between those cells are occurring, so that all of that exuberant connectivity is what allows the brain to optimize and rewire itself. So I said 40 to 50% more neurons than the adult brain will utilize. And I think that it's important for us as NICU nurses to understand that what's happening there in that newborn brain, that rudimentary neurologic network, and then just even a month later, 2 months later, 3 months later, the experiences that we're providing families and these babies has a huge impact on what that neural network is going to look like for them. And really, it happens right before our eyes, moment to moment, minute to minute, hour to hour. We are building their foundational brain architecture with the care that we provide. So just a little bit more about this brain growth that's occurring. So it occurs in two basic stages you can think of as overproduction and pruning. So there's this exuberant connectivity, all of these connections are forming, and then they're pruned back in this use or lose manner. And that happens 3 critical times during our life. So in utero or in the NICU, in the case of a preemie, between 0 and 3 years, and then again, in adolescence, there's another period where that happens. And again, that exuberant growth gives the brain enormous potential when that potential is harnessed in a positive way. So the graph there to the right shows the sensory pathways are among the first pathways to develop, and then the language and higher cognitive function comes later. And you can see that those pathways are very steep very early in life. So what are the factors that impact brain development? And the short answer is it's complicated. There are so many things that impact the developing brain, and some things we have no control over, but a lot of things we do. So we know that genes provide a basic blueprint, and then all these other things come into play at different points in time to influence the developing brain. So there are maternal factors, mom's nutrition. I think Zipi was who touched on briefly talking about the mental health of parents, and the mental health of the mother actually impacts the developing fetus immensely as well. Exposure, so talking about like mom's exposure during pregnancy to medications, different toxins, infections, all of those things impact the developing brain. And then, the baby's born, and then there are these neonatal factors. So nutrition is hugely important. Like 70% of the calories that we provide go to growing the brain, and that kind of makes sense because how quickly that brain is growing after the baby's born. Of course, a ton of calories are going to be needed to fuel that growth. So when we're optimizing nutrition, we're really optimizing brain development. Infection, so all of our CLABSI bundles, and when we're talking about preventing ventilator-associated pneumonia and, preventing all of those things that we do, the IVH bundles like Jill was talking about, all of those things are neuroprotective as well because, we're preventing infections that can cause widespread inflammation and impact brain development. The IVH impact is obvious to prevent those bleeds. So all of those factors are important, and as nurses, we have a big impact on that in our practice. But early life experiences, I think, is one of the main points that nurses really can step in and help to make a positive impact on the early life experiences that we're providing to these babies. And I'm not talking just about in the care that we provide, but also in the experiences that we facilitate for these babies. So, what are the critical concepts to understand in early brain development? And these are from the Harvard Center for Child Development. So we have experience-dependent synapse formation, serve and return, and toxic stress. So the experience-dependent synapse formation is our first main concept, and that is that the experiences that you provide will shape that growing brain because the connections that are made are use or lose. Okay, so those connections that are used frequently, the pathways that are stimulated frequently will strengthen and myelinate, and those that are not will be pruned back. Okay, serve and return. So, it's funny to kind of think about, I think thinking of serve and return, it's easy when you're thinking of like a toddler and you have this very obvious back and forth interaction with them. But again, talking about how nicely the previous presentations feed into this, Zeepi showed us that even very young infants, you can see that they have that serve and return interaction as well. And that is incredibly important for their early brain development to have that serve and return between a caring adult, ideally their parents. Toxic stress. So this is a negative impactor of early brain development. And Mary, those were some of the most interesting things to me that I learned from Mary early on were about toxic stress and the impact of toxic stress. I didn't really understand. I'd never heard that before early in my nursing career until I learned it from Mary. So, some amount of stress it's necessary, right, for the survival of a person. We have to, we experience stress, we grow from it, it's tolerable. But toxic stress is when your HPA axis here, so the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, is this feedback loop between your brain and your endocrine system. And what happens in toxic stress is that stress response system is activated repeatedly in the absence of protective relationships. So it's a negative feedback loop. So your brain is releasing, you're telling your body to release this cortisol, and ideally that over time, you're releasing cortisol, but then that stress is mitigated by some protective measure and it dials back down. But if it's repeatedly activated, your brain is like, whoa, we got to slow this down, adrenals, and it tells your adrenal glands, we got to stop releasing this cortisol. But your brain relies on the end product of that cortisol to tell it to slow down, to stop that reaction. And so when it's repeatedly activated over time, there's not enough circulating cortisol to turn that off. So people that are experiencing chronic stress and pain, they have lower baseline levels of cortisol just circulating, and they have higher levels following stressful events. So it really can have a detrimental effect to so many other systems in the body, which is a whole other discussion, but it's just bad stuff, let's say toxic stress. But what's very interesting to me is, and I think important for all of us to know, is that the hormones that are involved in this axis are detectable as early as 8 to 12 weeks gestation. So this system is very much operational for our preemies. Our sensory development is also happening early in gestation and postnatally, especially with preemies. And I want to remind you how important it is for us to understand that those systems are meant to develop in a specific order, and they are not stimulated in that intended order in the NICU. And what can happen are these sensory processing disorders. So it can be thought of as a neurologic traffic jam, right? So we're getting all of this sensory information, and our brain, because the senses were stimulated out of order, it either mounts a heightened response to something or can't mount the correct response, the intended response. So neurologic traffic jam. So what are the consequences when things are not stimulated in the order that they're intended, or if we have too much negative stimulation? So I'm just going to go through some outcome data just to build the foundation for why programs that provide positive sensory input are so important. So this is a study looking at variations in sensory processing patterns, and it was a study of 160 premature babies, and they were born less than 32 weeks with a median gestational age of 26 weeks, and they had a median length of stay of 65 days. So they were assessed at 4 years of age using a short sensory profile, and what that does, it looks at their sensory processing patterns, okay? And what they found overall was that almost half fell in the atypical range for sensory processing. So you can see at the top there, that's the dark Those that had abnormal sensory processing patterns are those in the light gray and the dark gray. So a significant portion of them had differences in their sensory processing. And I think what's important is to think about what that means for those kids. Because when you can't interact with your environment the same way as your peers, it impacts the way that you play with them, the way that you integrate in the classroom, and it really marginalizes these kids. So these sensory processing patterns it's critical to understand that this is a potential outcome, a likely outcome for a lot of our kids, so that we can use that information to empower our parents to seek early assessment and intervention for these differences. It's so important that we encourage them and that we have these follow-up programs so that they're getting assessed by the right people so that they can get them the right help as soon as possible. Developmental trajectory. So this is another outcome, just looking at their Bailey mental motor scores and then their reading and math assessments. So this is more like cognitive and motor outcome data. This study took kids from an early childhood sample birth cohort and selected out kids that had a NICU length of stay. So that gave them a sample of 2,100 children, and they followed them from birth to kindergarten. And they gave Bailey mental and motor scores at 9 months and 24 months, and then reading and math proficiency in preschool and kindergarten. And you can see that these graphs break it down by the length of stay. So the dark bar are the kids that spent like a week in the NICU, then progressing to about a month in the NICU, then 2 months in the NICU, and then over 2 months in the NICU is the lightest graph. And you can see, the lightest bar rather, you can see that pretty much across the board, the kids that spent the most significant amount of time in the NICU scored the poorest on these follow-up. Just again highlighting, yes, that's upsetting that that is true, but it also is empowering because then that gives us something to educate the parents on, to say, you know, you really need to make your follow-up appointments to follow up with the developmental clinic so that they can be assessed, so that they can get them the help that they need early. So this is one other slide that I want to show you. So this is actually a graphic showing the impact of neglect on the developing brain. So I'll start by saying this was a terribly unethical study. These kids, so kids were randomized to go into a loving foster environment or not go into a loving foster environment, okay, is essentially what they did to these kids. But the outcome data that we have from this is, I think, very important. So these were children that were, they call it early adopted, but basically they went into this foster care where the parents, the families that took them into this early foster care were taught targeted therapies to engage them and give them the, positive exposure, positive sensory exposure. And a lot of that had to do with their language exposure, reading and talking to them. So they looked at the kids that were adopted the earliest or went into the foster program the earliest fared strikingly better than the kids that were left in the institution between 6 and 24 months, and then more than 24 months. You can see that the children that were there less than 6 months had very low incidence of cognitive impairment. So they termed the sort of grouping of symptoms that they saw in these children, they called it institutionalization syndrome. Now, last year, we heard from Dr. Paige Church about the phenotype of prematurity, okay? So all of these outcomes that I showed about, having the sensory processing differences and cognitive impairment, like those are all different things that we think of in that phenotype of prematurity that we see in our babies. Now, the institutionalization syndrome that they talk about is characterized by growth delays, neurological behavioral alterations, low IQ scores, attachment disorders, and impaired language development. So, not saying that I want to liken the care that we provide to orphanage care, but we do have a lot of sensory deprivation that occurs in our NICU. It's just a fact, especially in our private room NICUs. So I think that the overarching point I want to make is that it's amazing that the babies that we're saving, the medical advances that we've made are incredible, and not to take away from that, but let's turn that into thrivability for these babies. So, we know that the quality of developmental care that we provide can make an impact, not just for these babies, but for their long term, their life, their families' lives. It makes a huge impact what we do and how we do it. So I always kind of think of trying to understand what my babies are experiencing while they're in the NICU compared to what they should be experiencing at that same gestational age. So, in the NICU, it's overstimulating, a lot of alarm sounds and loud voices and painful interventions, right? That HPA axis is just like working on overdrive, being stimulated repeatedly. All that intensified by the impact of maternal separation, which is profound, perhaps the most profound thing that impacts our babies negatively. Compared to what should they be experiencing. So in the womb, they're not in a sensory deprivation tank, right? So it's not that they're not being stimulated, but they're being stimulated in a positive way. So they're in this like nice, flexed, warm environment, listening to the mom's heartbeat. They're hearing muted sounds from the outside world. They're hearing mom's voice, like CP was talking to us about. So what can we do to try to mimic that environment?
When you're in a neonatal intensive care unit in an open ward where the beds are all closely together within one large room, the babies experience the sounds throughout the environment and are privy to what's going on with their neighbor. Over really the past decade, the focus of care within the neonatal intensive care unit has been on minimizing the amount of sensory exposure because they're very fragile, they're vulnerable, and there have been studies that have shown that loud auditory exposures can result in these drops in heart rate and oxygen saturation level. However, I think that we're starting to move a little bit away from that because now we're in a private room environment. You can completely get rid of all of the sensory exposure that a baby experiences. And to some extent, you could even have complete sensory abatement, which we also know is not beneficial. So rather than swinging the pendulum too far, we just need to allow it to settle somewhere in the middle where we're giving those positive, appropriate sensory exposures for patients.
So positive sensory exposure. So that was Bakke Pineda, who is an occupational therapist at Washington, University of St. Louis, NICU. She is an occupational therapist and who was part of the team that developed the SENSE program, which is, I encourage you to, we heard about it at last year's conference, but I definitely encourage you to look at that. So, I included that because she nicely summarized the importance of the sensory deprivation. So, that we really are putting our babies in an environment where they are either getting almost all negative sensory stimulus or they're getting no sensory input at all for these lengthy periods of time, and then negative stuff, and then these long periods of no sensory input at all, which is detrimental to their development. So there's a difference between sound and noise. So for a long time, we thought that was the best thing to do, like to have this minimally stimulating environment. But there's a difference. So loud noises in the NICU, yes, can interfere with sleep and even be perceived as painful to the babies, but sound is beneficial. So soft voices, especially parents, reading, soft music are beneficial to their brain development. So this was, again, a quote from Bakke Pineda, and it was a study that looked at auditory exposure in that St. Louis Children's Hospital NICU, and looking at preterm infants born at less than 28 weeks gestation. 33 were in like an open ward environment and 25 were in private rooms. And they had their auditory exposure quantified at birth, at 30 weeks and 34 weeks postmenstrual age, and then at term equivalent. And they compared this to babies that were born at full term that went to their mom in the nursery, or rooming in rather, with mom, well newborn. So over a 16-hour period of time, the NICU preemies heard more electronic noises, so all that beeping and the ventilator noises that we heard in that video, but about 14,000 fewer spoken words than the term babies. And that's just in one 16-hour period. That's really impactful information for me, that we really need to focus on trying to mimic, trying to increase those beneficial words that our babies are hearing. So this will be Dr. Inder talking about more similar auditory exposure studies.
The environment is very important to the way the newborn brain is formed, particularly when you're born prematurely and you're in a neonatal intensive care unit. One example of this is we studied the amount of auditory exposure that a baby has, depending on the environment the baby's in and how much adult language exposure there is around the baby. And we found if the baby was in a very quiet environment where there wasn't human voice being heard, that the area of the brain involved in language didn't develop. Whereas if the baby was actually in a very noisy environment where there was a lot of talking going on, then the baby's language area did develop. And most importantly, when we followed those children up 2 years later, the children in the environment with good language exposure had nearly 10 IQ points more in language development than those who had been in the very quiet environment, emphasizing that the brain will take the information around it to influence its development.
So the brain will take the information around it. It will take the experiences around it to influence its development. So that brings me to language nutrition, right? So I never heard of this term language nutrition before. I read about it in an article that was in Advances years ago, and it really hit me that, wow, this is something that we really need to focus on as NICU nurses. So language nutrition is the concept that just as food nourishes the body, words nourish the brain. So language-rich adult-child interactions beginning at birth have a direct impact on their brain development and their social, emotional, and cognitive development, their language and their literacy. And what we know, literacy, early literacy is tremendously important. So how important? The 30 million word gap, I don't know if you've heard of that study, but basically it's like this idea that they showed that kids that are born in lower income families compared to kids that were born in higher income families heard 30 million less words by the time that they were ready for school. And that impacted, so the number of words that you hear by the time you're at the age of 5 is a predictor of your third grade reading level, which is a predictor of your long-term success in life, your education level, and your income level. And how strong a predictor? It's in fact the single strongest predictor of a child's academic success, not their parents' socioeconomic status, their parents' level of education, their income, their ethnicity. It's the quality and quantity of words spoken to the baby in the first 3 years of life, the single strongest predictor. So the article in Advances was talking about the language nutrition, but in the context of this Talk With Me Baby program. And this was a program that was intended for more of a well-child situation, so educating families about the power that they have to impact their child's later academic success. Because when you know better, you do better. So, educating them that they should be speaking to their baby, talking to their baby, reading to their baby early and often, because if you do this, your child will succeed. Research has demonstrated that your child will succeed. So this is about the Talk With Me Baby program, and it's very loud. Get ready to do the volume.
All parents want the best for their baby, and we know healthy food helps grow a healthy baby. But to grow a healthy brain, babies need more. Babies need lots of loving words. A baby's brain grows super fast. Research shows that the amount of loving words a baby hears in the first 3 years of life can make a big difference. Meet baby Ella's mom, dad, grandma, and sister all shower her with lots of loving words and encouragement. and every word she hears helps her brain grow. By talking, reading, and singing with Ella, everyone is helping her develop an essential life skill, the ability to read by 3rd grade. And once Ella learns to read, she'll be ready and able to learn anything she wants. But what if Ella doesn't get lots of loving words as a baby? Without a steady diet of loving words, Ella may only know half the words of her friends, which will make her feel lost and behind. Without knowing as many words, it will be harder for Ella to express her feelings when she gets frustrated, and school stops being fun. If she doesn't learn to read, she'll be 4 times more likely to drop out of school. And it gets worse. Kids who don't finish high school are more likely to have poor health, become a teen parent, be unemployed, and end up in jail. Not the future we imagined for baby Ella, is it? That's why it's so important for families, friends, and caregivers to talk with their babies.
So that, is dramatic. Like, I'm not, I mean, it's pretty dramatic, right? I'm not like picturing my little preemie that I'm taking care of behind jail bars one day. But I think that the takeaway from that, is that it really makes a big difference, more so than I think people realize. Just that simple act of reading and talking to a baby can make such a huge impact in their life. So, as I said, I read about this program and advances, and I'm thinking to myself, like, man, I work in this surgical NICU. Babies are with us for a very long time. They're very sick. Parents are not there, and that is a whole other complicated issue. They're not there for a lot of reasons. But what can we do? We're understaffed just like every other NICU. We're busy. We have all these other things that are taking us away. How can we get these babies read to on a consistent basis, talked to on a consistent basis? And I, at the time, was my shared governance rep to Congress, my unit's shared governance rep. And the volunteer services director came before Congress and said, I have all these high school volunteers and I don't have a job for them. They're coming in, next month. I need an idea. And I thought, they can read to our babies like that, we can just train them to come into the unit and read. I think that this is a simple thing that we can do. And so I went and talked to her about it, and we very rapidly rolled out this program, which we called Baby Bookworms. And there you can see is my medical staff and nurses, and for Halloween that first year, they were baby bookworms, our babies. So that's one of our little baby bookworms there, being read to by the volunteer. So what are the critical elements of a language nutrition program? So you need somebody to read, right? Families preferred, but I would encourage you to think creatively and consider using volunteers to fill in the gaps. You need reading materials. So, are they going to be physical books? Are they going to be e-readers? There are like pros, cons with both of those options. You need to decide what babies you're going to read to, and then you need to figure out what the workflow is going to be in your unit. So this is probably like the most common question I get. Why can't we just use a TV or a tablet? Like, why can't I just put an audiobook on or just sit the kid in front of, Harry Potter or whatever and have them, have that happen to them? So it actually makes a big impact. It goes back to that serve and return. So it's critically important for the purposes of language nutrition that it's a live reader who is making that eye contact with that baby and reading to them. And they've shown through some of the technology that ZP was talking to us about, when they map the brain in real time and they show where those language centers are, and a live person is talking to a child, reading to a child, those centers light up and you can see that they're being stimulated. But if you put that same child in front of a screen, even if it's giving them the same information, it doesn't light up. It doesn't stimulate them because there's no serve and return with a TV screen. So it's critically important. And that is a piece of information that I try to share with every family that I take care of. So your language nutrition team, you have the baby, the parents, family that you're partnering with, nurses, and volunteers and I would say the providers too, to some degree, while they're not directly involved in the program, it is important that they advocate for it, and I'll explain that in a little bit. So stress and engagement cues. One of the important things is education for the volunteers. So I will say that has been one of the biggest challenges of the program, is getting those volunteers educated so that they can come and do this very important task in a safe way. So our volunteers go through an education program, and I do it live maybe like once a year, and then we record it as a webinar. And then during their orientation process, because they have to go through the regular volunteer education process and vetting through the hospital, but then they go through this special baby bookworms education where they view my webinar and then they train one-on-one with an experienced reader. And one of the most important things that they learn is stress and engagement cues. So they're taught to be looking at that baby, making eye contact with that baby, and recognizing when they want more and what are the signs that they don't want more, okay? So that they can disengage from that interaction to make sure that it's positive for them. And this is one of the things that I would say is the biggest struggle, because they are not medical providers, they're not nurses, and so well-intentioned, they want to come in and read, but it continues to be a challenge. You really have to have an open dialogue with the volunteers and empower the staff nurses to intervene, if they feel like it's inappropriate. So just keep that in mind to make sure that you're educating your volunteers so that they're reading in a positive and safe way in the unit. Parentese, so ZP was talking about like mother tongue, motherese, so this is like that melodic tone, inverted pitch, exaggerated gestures, facial expressions. So there's a way that you can read to a baby and talk to a baby that makes the biggest positive impact on their development, and that's this parentese reading technique. And again, there is a short video if you want to watch that on your own. These two guys are pretty funny when they're showing us how to speak in parentese. And that's another element of the education.
This is all about
reading materials. So this was like another big bump in the road that we hit, where initially we started with like hard board books. We would wipe them down in between babies. The volunteers would come on the unit and they had this like little cart that they pushed around, and they would wipe down the books in between the babies. And they weren't holding the babies. They were, because they were kids, teenage kids were coming into the unit. So the babies would stay in their bed or in their swing, and they would just read to them that way. Our infection control did not like that. And let's just say perhaps they weren't asked permission, or I didn't ask their permission before I started the program. So that's another thing to make sure that you think about all the stakeholders when you are launching a program and vetting it through the proper channels, and that you have the right approval. So in the end, we did compromise to switch to the e-readers. I don't love them for the reasons that you see here, but if that's what kept the program going, then that's what it had to be. But we do encourage the parents to use physical books when they're reading, and we do encourage the volunteers to make sure that they're like holding the e-readers and still making that eye contact. But physical books for sure are the way to go, if you can make that happen safely. Program eligibility, 32 weeks and medically stable. That has to do with when those parts of the brain, when that sensory integration is happening, that's the time that it has been shown to be most beneficial. So there are studies being done on younger gestations with maternal voice. So I think that because these are volunteers, we felt that was the most evidence-based age to start. So 32 weeks medically stable, they can be read to. And they can be in an incubator. It's not a hard stop, but we do teach the volunteers to recognize the decibel level of their own voice and understand that's amplified in a isolette. So during training, they use one of these sound meters. They're not on the unit with it, but just like during training so that they can hear themselves talk and understand what their natural voice level is, because we all have very different natural voice levels. Developing the workflow, where when you're starting a new project, whatever your one thing is, it's important that you start small and scale it large. So it's much easier to make these small, sustainable changes and then go back to the table and say, okay, what went well, what didn't? Okay, let's try it on a bigger set. And that's exactly what we did. This program started with one volunteer, me and one volunteer walking around the unit reading to babies, me and one volunteer talking through the training, and then we scaled it from there.
Well, that wraps up this week's presentation with Sarah Bakke and language nutrition. I hope that you really enjoyed this background and that you'll stay tuned for more live streams every Monday, 11 a.m. Pacific, all month, and we're going to focus on some different programs and getting started and then beyond the NICU. So if you like this presentation, if you like these kinds of videos, please do us a favor, hit the subscribe button so that YouTube knows that you want to see more videos like this from us. So again, thanks for being here, and